A line has been crossed. In the blue and historically turbulent waters of the Caribbean Sea, a dangerous game of provocation and power, which had been played in the shadows of diplomacy and economic espionage, has reached its boiling point. This is no longer a silent crisis whispered in the corridors of power in Washington and Beijing. It is an open challenge declared under the tropical sun for the whole world to see and understand its implications. The People's Liberation Army Navy plan, in an unprecedented maneuver in its modern history of power projection, has not only arrived to support its besieged and economically devastated ally, Venezuela, but to launch a direct, calculated, and undeniable challenge to the hegemony of the United States in its own strategic backyard. What were, just a few months ago, tensions marked by economic sanctions, accusations of corporate espionage, and diplomatic disputes, has now transformed into an imminent and palpable naval confrontation. Pentagon intelligence sources confirm, through satellite imagery and electronic surveillance, that a Chinese naval task force, including some of its most advanced type destroyers, known as aircraft carrier killers, and Type A frigates, is on its final route to Venezuelan waters. This fleet, representing the pinnacle of Chinese naval modernization, is not just a presence, it is a declaration of intent. In response, the U.S. Southern Command, SOUTHCOM, has raised its alert level to DEFCON, mobilizing naval and aerial resources from strategic bases in Florida, Puerto Rico, and the Guantanamo Naval Base in Cuba. Beijing is deliberately and at monumental risk, testing the limits of Washington's patience and the validity of the Monroe Doctrine, a pillar of American foreign policy that has endured for 200 years and is now under the most serious scrutiny. This in-depth script will not only narrate real-time events but will dissect the layers of complexity behind them. We will analyze how this challenge was meticulously constructed over 2 decades of Chinese investments in Latin America, transforming the region from a mere commodity supplier into a geopolitical battleground. We will explore the economic, ideological, and strategic motivations behind Xi Jinping's audacity, who sees in Venezuela a golden opportunity to redefine the world order. And crucially, we will assess the potentially catastrophic consequences that a single miscalculation, a misinterpreted warning shot, an accidental collision between ships, or an uncontrolled rhetorical escalation could bring to global stability, with the real risk of a conflict between nuclear powers. Prepare to understand why the arrival of the Chinese fleet is not a simple courtesy visit, a humanitarian mission, or even a standard commercial protection mission. It is, in fact, the boldest move on the great geopolitical chessboard of the Saint Century. It is a move that forces America's hand, placing it before an unbearable dilemma: retreat and admit the end of its undisputed primacy in the Western Hemisphere, setting a dangerous precedent for other powers, or advance and risk a direct conflict with a rival nuclear power, with incalculable human and economic costs. Join us in this detailed analysis to unravel the complexities of this critical moment, where rhetoric has become reality and warships speak louder than diplomats, echoing the drums of a new Cold War. When the chronic tension between Washington and Caracas seemed to have reached yet another of its cyclical peaks, a new and formidable actor entered the scene, fundamentally altering the strategic equation: the People's Republic of China. As initially reported by the Financial Times and subsequently detailed by internal sources in Beijing, China's entry into the Caribbean theater of operations was not an impulsive reaction, but a carefully planned and choreographed operation, internally known as Operation Strategic Shield. This operation reflects a fundamental shift in Chinese military doctrine, which now emphasizes the capability of blue water power projection, distant oceanic operations, to protect its global interests. Official statements from the Chinese Ministry of National Defense, delivered by spokesperson Colonel Wu Qian in a tense press conference, confirmed the dispatch of a long-range naval task force to the Atlantic. The public justification was the conduct of routine joint exercises with partner nations and to ensure the security of vital trade routes for the global economy, threatened by regional instability. However, anonymous sources within the high echelons of the Communist Party, who leaked information to the South China Morning Post, painted a much more assertive picture. An official from the Joint Staff Department of the Central Military Commission reportedly stated that the mission was to ensure regional stability and protect the sovereign interests in Chinese citizens abroad against external aggression and internal instability. The diplomatic language, with its emphasis on external aggression, barely disguised the real intention. This was not a symbolic gesture, but direct military support, with the clear objective of deterring and, if necessary, challenging any American military intervention. The implicit message was that China was willing to risk a direct confrontation to protect its investments and its strategic partner, raising the stakes of the dispute. Beijing's motivation for this audacious move is multifaceted, complex and deeply rooted in its long-term strategy to become the leading global power by the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic. A high-ranking official from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in a rare interview on condition of anonymity for the Reuters agency, bluntly summarized Beijing's stance. China cannot and will not allow 2 decades of strategic cooperation and investments exceeding $1 billion to be annihilated by a change of political regime in Caracas, orchestrated by Washington to restore a unipolar hegemony that no longer exists. This statement is not empty rhetoric. Over the past decade, China has become Venezuela's largest creditor through complex oil-for-loans agreements. These funds financed everything from the modernization of oil fields in the Orinoco Belt, which holds the world's largest heavy oil reserves, to the construction of railways, ports, and the controversial implementation of Huawei's G network, which, according to Western security analysts, gives Beijing unprecedented access to Venezuelan communications and potentially sensitive data. Venezuela, with the world's largest proven oil reserves, has become an irreplaceable pillar for China's energy security, ensuring the supply of vital raw materials for its growing economy and consolidating its presence in a region traditionally dominated by the U.S. Furthermore, Venezuela serves as a crucial geographical foothold for the expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative in Latin America. By positioning its navy thousands of miles from home, China is not just protecting its money, it is sending an unequivocal signal to the world. It is declaring that its sphere of influence no longer has geographical boundaries and now extends challengingly to the Americas. In Caracas, the announcement of Chinese support was met with euphoria and relief by the Maduro regime. In a carefully staged press conference at Miraflores Palace, Nicolas Maduro, ostentatiously displaying a state-of-the-art Huawei smartphone, publicly thanked President Xi Jinping. "China is our elder brother, our strategic ally with whom we will build the multipolar future and justice for the peoples of the world." This moment, immediately broadcast in prime time by Chinese state television CCTV and the Xinhua news agency, was presented as the symbol of the unbreakable alliance between the two countries against imperialist and hegemonic U.S. aggression. This narrative not only reinforces the legitimacy of Maduro's regime internally, but projects China's image as a responsible global superpower, willing to directly confront Western power to defend its allies and a new model of global governance. Washington Post analysts observe that, although Maduro's gestures may seem largely symbolic, they conceal a serious military-political strategy. China, by openly positioning itself in defense of Venezuela, is sending a clear message to the world. Its sphere of influence is no longer limited to Asia. This is a paradigmatic shift in Chinese foreign policy, which traditionally focused on regional issues and non-intervention. Now Beijing demonstrates a growing willingness to project its military and economic power on a global scale, challenging the established order and seeking a more prominent role in global governance. Venezuela, in this context, becomes a strategic focal point, not only for its natural wealth, but as a springboard for the projection of Chinese power in the Western Hemisphere, literally in the backyard of the United States. This Chinese audacity not only reconfigures the balance of power in the region, but also raises profound questions about the future of global geopolitics and the possibility of a new Cold War, with flashpoints in unexpected locations. The Chinese challenge, launched so audaciously and publicly in the Caribbean, did not go unnoticed in Washington. The American response was swift, robust, and laden with symbolism, reflecting the gravity with which the White House and the Pentagon viewed the maneuver. The spark that ignited the fuse of counter-escalation came from a place already known for its inflammatory rhetoric, a political rally in Florida, a state with a large and influential Cuban and Venezuelan diaspora, crucial for American politics. Donald Trump, amidst his campaign, announced a massive and unprecedented expansion of the military presence off the coast of Venezuela to eradicate drug trafficking, dismantle terrorist networks, and stifle the tyranny that oppresses the Venezuelan people. This declaration, far from being mere political bluster, materialized into concrete actions within hours. Commercial satellite images from Maxar Technologies, quickly analyzed and released by specialized media outlets such as Naval News and The War Zone, confirmed what many feared. Carrier Strike Group, CSG, led by the imposing nuclear-powered supercarrier USS George Washington, CVN, was deployed from its home port in Norfolk, Virginia, to the southern Caribbean. The strike group was not alone. It was accompanied by at least one Ticonderoga-class cruiser, the USS Philippine Sea, CGC, equipped with the advanced Aegis combat system, capable of tracking and engaging multiple targets simultaneously, and a squadron of Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, including the USS Farragut, DDG, and the USS Forrest Sherman, DDG, armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles. Furthermore, Pentagon sources confirmed the presence of the fast attack submarine USS Newport News, SSNE, a Los Angeles-class submarine whose stealth mission is to track and, if necessary, neutralize submarine threats, a clear reference to any Chinese submarine that might be accompanying the fleet. U.S. Southern Command, SOUTHCOM, headquartered in Doral, Florida, issued an official statement asserting that the operations, dubbed Operation Freedom Sentinel, aimed to ensure security, stability, and freedom of navigation in the Western Hemisphere, in accordance with international law. The statement, however, contained a phrase clearly directed at Beijing. Any external state actor seeking to destabilize the region and support illicit regimes will face a firm and decisive response. The message was unequivocal. Washington was rising to the challenge, positioning its most powerful pieces on the Caribbean chessboard. For the Venezuelan government, now visibly emboldened by Chinese support, the arrival of the American fleet was characterized by Maduro as a desperate declaration of a hunt by a declining empire. The popular response, orchestrated by the government, was not long in coming. Tens of thousands of supporters took to the streets of Caracas, with banners that now included the Chinese flag alongside the Venezuelan, proclaiming, "Venezuela is not alone." Not the U.S. invasion. In a nationally televised address, Maduro, flanked by his generals, vowed to fight to the last bullet, rhetoric aimed at galvanizing internal support and sending a signal of intransigence to Washington. This mobilization, however, was not limited to protests and speeches. In direct response to the growing American military presence, Venezuela announced large-scale military exercises, dubbed Bolivarian Shield, on the island of La Orquilla. For the first time, the participation of Chinese military observers and advisors in these maneuvers was confirmed. The demonstration of defensive capability, which included the launch of Chinese-made sea anti-ship missiles, was a clear warning that the country, with its new allies, would not be an easy target. The Caribbean, once an uncontested American sphere of influence, was rapidly transforming into a powder keg, where the world's two largest superpowers were now moving their most powerful pieces, observing each other with suspicion and hostility. In Washington, China's entry into the Venezuelan scenario was not met with indifference, but with growing alarm echoing through the corridors of power, from the Pentagon to Capitol Hill. The Pentagon, in particular, watched with great concern the movement of the Chinese fleet in the Atlantic. Reports from Pentagon officials indicated that U.S. ships had already begun operations to intercept and, if necessary, destroy Venezuelan vessels allegedly carrying drugs and weapons. This action, although publicly justified as part of anti-drug efforts, carried an implicit message of warning and a show of force. However, behind the scenes, a much larger and more complex question loomed over the American capital. Would the United States risk a direct confrontation with China if Chinese forces actually moved to defend Venezuela? The Wall Street Journal, citing sources from the National Security Council, revealed that in private meetings, then-President Trump had considered a scenario of a limited naval blockade. However, his advisors reportedly warned of the catastrophic consequences if even a single Chinese destroyer were damaged. The memory of the Cuban Missile Crisis of loomed like a ghost, reminding everyone how quickly a regional crisis can escalate into a global confrontation with nuclear potential. Beijing's audacity, willing for the first time in its history to challenge Washington not only for its own interests, but in defense of a country in another hemisphere, was something previously thought impossible. This paradigm shift, according to experts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, signals that China is transitioning from a policy of regional defense to one of global expansion. Venezuela, with its vast oil reserves and strategic location in the U.S. backyard, has become the focal point of this new strategy. Meanwhile, the crisis resonated in other global capitals. In NATO, the debate was intense and revealed deep divisions. According to Politico, in the corridors of Brussels, allies failed to reach a consensus. The United Kingdom and Poland, aligned with a tougher U.S. approach, insisted on the need for a collective response in case of confrontation with China. On the other hand, Germany and France adopted a more cautious stance. A source from the German Foreign Ministry stated that Berlin considered it madness to fight China over Venezuela. Paris, in turn, proposed a diplomatic mission to mediate between Washington and Beijing, seeking a solution that would avoid military escalation. This division within NATO highlighted the complexity of the situation and the reluctance of some European powers to engage in a direct confrontation with China over an issue they considered distant from their immediate interests. In Latin America, opinions were equally divided. According to El País, Cuba and Nicaragua officially expressed their willingness to provide Venezuela with infrastructure for joint defensive actions, strengthening ideological and strategic ties with Maduro's regime. In contrast, countries like Peru and Chile feared that the presence of Chinese ships could militarize the entire region and trigger an arms race, further destabilizing a continent already prone to instability. This regional polarization reflected the influence of different geopolitical blocs and the complexity of international relations in Latin America. Global markets, always sensitive to any sign of instability, reacted immediately. Bloomberg observed that investors were pricing in the risk of a full-scale conflict that could paralyze oil supplies from the region, causing a devastating impact on the world economy. Foreign Affairs magazine, in its latest issue, grimly summarized the situation. "We are witnessing the beginning of a new Cold War, but with a hotspot in the Western Hemisphere." The comparison to the Cuban Missile Crisis was inevitable, but with a crucial difference. Instead of Soviet missiles, there was the Chinese fleet, and instead of Cuba, there was Venezuela. The question increasingly voiced in world capitals was whether this local crisis would escalate into a global confrontation. The answer was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. Humanity had entered a new and dangerous stage where every misstep could lead to catastrophe. The Venezuelan crisis, with the unexpected and audacious Chinese intervention, is not just a regional conflict. It represents a litmus test for one of the oldest and most fundamental pillars of United States foreign policy, the Monroe Doctrine. Proclaimed by President James Monroe, this doctrine established that any intervention by European powers in the affairs of the Americas would be considered a hostile act against the United States. For almost 2 centuries, the Monroe Doctrine served as the cornerstone of American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, shaping power relations and ensuring that no external power could challenge Washington's influence in its own sphere of interest. Now, with Chinese warships sailing in the Caribbean and Beijing openly declaring its military and economic support for Venezuela, the Monroe Doctrine is being challenged in an unprecedented way. Bloomberg analysts argued that the current crisis could become a turning point for global geopolitics. If China successfully defends Venezuela, it would signal the effective collapse of the Monroe Doctrine, opening the doors to a new era of multipolarity in Latin America. This would mean that the United States would no longer be the sole power with the right to intervene or influence the affairs of the region, and other major powers such as China and even Russia could establish their own spheres of influence. On the other hand, if the U.S. manages to break Venezuelan and Chinese resistance, it would send a clear message to all countries in the region. Washington is still the master in its hemisphere. Such an outcome would reaffirm the Monroe Doctrine and American primacy, but at a potentially very high cost, both in terms of resources and global reputation. The dilemma is profound. Yielding to Chinese influence would mean accepting an erosion of American hegemony, while confronting China directly could lead to a conflict of catastrophic proportions. Washington's choice will not only affect Venezuela, but will redefine the U.S. role in the world and the structure of the international order. This situation is further complicated by the fact that, amidst the events in Venezuela, former President Trump was actively campaigning, with the central theme of a strong hand against dictators. His speeches were filled with incisive statements. "We will not allow China to interfere in our region. Venezuela will be free." This rhetoric, while powerful for his electoral base, concealed a complex strategic dilemma. The question was not just whether the U.S. should confront China, but whether it could do so without triggering a large-scale war. The stakes are high, and the outcome of this crisis will define the future of global geopolitics for decades to come. To understand more about how these tensions can affect your daily life and the future of the global economy, continue following our in-depth analyses. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any updates on this and other crucial topics. Amidst the military and diplomatic escalation, another battle unfolded with equal intensity: the war for the narrative. The gravity of the situation led many analysts to draw parallels with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Of Foreign Affairs magazine, in its latest issue, did not hesitate to state, "We are witnessing the beginning of a new Cold War, but with a hotspot in the Western Hemisphere." The comparison is inevitable and frightening. The crucial difference, however, lies in the actors and the instruments. Instead of secret Soviet missiles, we have the modern and visible Chinese fleet. And instead of Cuba, we have Venezuela, a nation rich in resources but economically fragile. This analogy serves as a grim warning, but also as a weapon in the propaganda war. In Caracas, state media incessantly broadcast images of Chinese ships, exalting Beijing's fraternal support and comparing the alliance to Cuba's resistance. In newspapers like the Cuban Granma characterized the event as the beginning of a new era of multilateralism. Venezuela's defense minister, Vladimir Padrino, declared that joint exercises with China would be a guarantee of peace, a statement that, for Washington, sounded like a direct provocation. On the other side, Washington's rhetoric, personified by Trump, was equally incisive. In his rallies, he hammered home the message of a strong hand against dictators, with speeches like, "We will not allow communist China to interfere in our region. Venezuela will be free." This duality of narratives created an ideological battlefield, where truth was often shaped to serve political interests. On social media, armies of bots linked to both sides flooded platforms with disinformation, seeking to influence global public opinion and justify their respective governments' actions. Therefore, the world holds its breath. We are witnessing the emergence of a new and dangerous phase in the confrontation between great powers. With Venezuela, unexpectedly, at center stage, the main question, still unanswered, is whether the United States will go to the ultimate consequences to respond to the challenge posed by China. History teaches us that in moments of crisis like this, every move, every word, every decision can have global repercussions. Humanity has entered a stage where a misstep in the Caribbean can, in fact, lead to a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. To understand the next moves in this deadly chess game and how they might affect the future of the global economy and peace, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications.